In Week 2 of the 2020 MLS season, in what was the last set of games before the season was suspended, the Chicago Fire traveled up to Foxborough, Massachusetts to take on the New England Revolution. All things considered, it was a pretty entertaining match. The Fire had looked a lot more formidable than what most people had predicted in the preseason. And the Revolution were playing with some urgency in their home opener, after surprisingly dropping their Week 1 match to the Montreal Impact. Both teams traded some nice goals, and the game ended in a 1-1 draw. A fair result for both teams, in my opinion. And that was it. Nothing else was really said about this one. I mean, what else needed to be said? It certainly wasn't the most hyped up matchup of the weekend, and there weren't any interesting storylines that surrounded this game. It was just Chicago and New England in another regular season game. And that was a far cry from what once was the most competitive rivalry in all of MLS. The Chicago Fire and the New England Revolution are the forgotten rivalry in MLS. And I'll get into that. But first, remember, if you're a fan of MLS or just curious to find out more about the league, please subscribe for more MLS content. And let me know what you want to see a video on in the future. Now, let's get back to the action. Okay, so the marketing team at MLS really likes to promote rivalries, but they seem to make a habit of only highlighting the rivalries that are close in proximity. Some of these are obvious, like Cascadia, 401 Derby, Cali Classico, El Trafico, Hudson River Derby. Others are classics like Atlantic Cup, Texas Derby, Rocky Mountain Cup, and some of these are newer rivalries, like the Hell is Real Derby and Orlando and Atlanta, whatever that one is called. I think it's natural for fan bases to dislike other fan bases in the region more than others, so I understand why they promote these matchups the most. But sometimes, it seems like a stretch. Like, I remember one year for MLS Rivalry Week, they highlighted Chicago Fire versus Sporting Kansas City. And I mean, I'm a Fire supporter, and I have never once considered Kansas City to be a rival. Now, that was the Dom Dwyer selfie game, so maybe I shouldn't be that annoyed, but even still. Hey, speaking of Kansas City, yeah, I know, I just made a video about them, but whatever. I always got the impression that RSL and Houston were their rivals. At least, that's where most of the animosity seems to come in between the fans. Also add in the playoff history, it just makes sense that these teams would be their rivals. And just to be sure I wasn't remembering it incorrectly, I looked it up, and sure enough, this Reddit post, although a couple years old, pretty much confirms this, that most SKC fans view RSL and Houston to be their rivals. Like, it just goes back to the first point I was making, that MLS marketing just doesn't really seem to care about hyping up any rivalries that aren't regional. And honestly, that's kind of a shame. It's like, at this point, I've just given up all hope of ever seeing the Fire and Revolution play during MLS Rivalry Week. Like, it ain't gonna happen. The two markets just aren't close enough. But at least I still have the memories. And trust me, there's a lot of them. What made this rivalry truly epic were the playoff encounters. There was a time when it was already known before the season even kicked off that Chicago and New England would meet in the playoffs. Like, it was destiny that one of these two teams' season would come to an end at the hands of the other. To prove this point, I went ahead and looked up every MLS season and counted up the most frequent playoff matchups in the league's first 24 seasons. And what I found is that there are 10 pairs of teams that have met in the MLS Cup playoffs 4 times. There are 5 pairs of teams that met in the playoffs 5 times. There is 1 pair of teams that have met in the playoffs 6 times, that being DC United and Red Bull New York. And with the most playoff battles of anyone else, Chicago Fire and New England Revolution. Those two have met 8 different times in the playoffs. And how about this? DC United and Red Bull New York. Remember, they've met 6 times. That's the second most in MLS history. But those 6 times span from 1996, their first playoff encounter, to their final playoff encounter in 2015. That's 20 years from their first to their last. Chicago and New England, meanwhile, they first met in the playoffs in 2000. Their last playoff matchup was in 2009. That is 8 out of 10 years in which the Fire and the Revolution met in the playoffs. The only exceptions being 2001 and 2004. No, by the way, 2004, the 2 teams met on the final day of the regular season, with the winner advancing to the MLS Cup playoffs and the loser getting eliminated. Technically, not the playoffs, but it might as well should have been. New England won on that day, knocking out the Chicago Fire 2-1. Fun fact about that game, all 3 goals came in a span of just 4 minutes. Okay, let's be honest. A lot of this can be contributed to the fact that a decade ago, MLS had half as many teams. So, yeah, it was a lot easier for teams to meet up in the playoffs repeatedly year after year. We probably won't ever see a pair of teams meet in the playoffs 8 times in a 10-year stretch ever again. Unless, of course, Seattle and Toronto keep making it back to MLS Cup. So, that's the numbers. Now, how about the moments? There's a lot of them. Remember 2000? Back when the playoffs were best of 3-game series? In the decisive Game 3 of the quarterfinals, the Fire completely embarrassed the Revs 6-0. Remember 2003? Eastern Conference Final, extra time, Chris Armas with the golden goal. Side note, unrelated, golden goal was awesome. They should totally bring that back. That is the best way to end extra time. Remember 2005? Clint Dempsey in his second year as a pro, scoring in the Eastern Conference Final and doing the stop, drop, and roll celebration? And then remember when the Fire thought they had the equalizer in stoppage time, only for it to be ruled offsides? Remember 2006? Second leg Eastern Conference semifinal, New England coming from 2 down to tie it and then win it in the PK shootout? Remember 2007 Eastern Conference Final, Taylor Twellman with maybe the best playoff goal ever with the bicycle kick in traffic as the game winner? Seriously? A bicycle kick? As a Fire supporter, I grew to hate this team. And I mean that with all sincerity. I despised the Revolution. I hated everyone on it. I hated Matt Reese. I hated Clint Dempsey. I hated Pat Noonan. I hated Steve Nicol. I hated Steve Ralston. And most of all, I hated Taylor Twellman. From 2004 to 2007, the Revolution ended the Chicago Fire season. And I wanted nothing more than just some sweet revenge. Like, it got to the point where I would have rather seen the Fire knock the Revolution out of the playoffs than see the Fire lift an MLS Cup. Like, it got that bad. 2008 Eastern Conference semifinal, second leg in Chicago. Aggregate score still tied 0-0. And then as a fan, this is my favorite moment in all of sports. I know, it's not a championship. It's not a record being broken. It's not even some remarkable set of goals. It's just an Eastern Conference semifinal. But I don't care. After 4 years of heartbreak, 2004, 05, 06, 07, I was never more happy and more relieved than after this win. I know, the Fire would lose in the next round to eventual MLS Cup champ Columbus Crew, but honestly, that's whatever at this point. I will always have the 2008 conference semifinals. and also the 2009 conference semis. The Fire would go on to win that series as well. But after the 09 season, the rivalry definitely fizzled out. And it's not just because they stopped meeting in the playoffs. The Fire entered into the decade of hell, starting it off by inexplicably firing their head coach, Dennis Hamlin, after back-to-back trips to the Eastern Conference Final, and replacing him with Carlos De Los Cobos. They also released former goalkeeper of the year, John Bush, just before the 2010 season in favor of Andrew Dykstra. It was also the year that Cuauhtemoc Blanco left, so yeah, 2010 was not good. The Fire then continued to miss on head coaches. Frank Klopas, he only had one playoff appearance. Frank Yallop, no playoff appearances. Veljko Paunovic, one playoff appearance. From 2000 to 2009, the Fire made the playoffs 9 times. From 2010 to 2019, the Fire made the playoffs just 2 times. And for the Revolution, the unfortunate early retirement of Taylor Twellman due to injury, the retirement of Jay Heaps, and the departure of Steve Ralston, all of this occurring in 2010, this led to some down years in New England. But it wasn't nearly as bad as the Fire's downfall. The hiring of Jay Heaps as head coach was huge, as he led the Revolution back to prominence and even led them to an MLS Cup appearance in 2014. Rivalries are at its best when both teams are good. But that hasn't happened since 2009. And over time, the rivalry essentially died. While the main point of this video was to highlight the playoff battles, it's important to note that this went beyond just that. For instance, the Fire and the Revs met in the Superliga semifinals in 2009 and the Superliga group stage in 2010. And there were multiple classic regular season games between these two teams. Probably the most notable was the first ever game in the Fire's new soccer-specific stadium. The Fire took a 3-1 lead in the 90th minute, only for the Revolution to score twice in stoppage time to tie the match. As a supporter, it's disappointing to see this rivalry just fizzle out. And it's disappointing to see everyone forget about it. But I get why. To me, as a fan, it's still a rivalry. Like, I refuse to ever buy a Revolution jersey and put it up on this wall, and that will never change. On the field, no, it's not a rivalry. Like, that chapter of MLS has ended. But make no mistake about it, it was one of the most entertaining chapters in MLS history. Now, your turn. What do you think? What rivalries in MLS are underappreciated and deserve some more love? Let me know. And also, thank you for watching. One more thing. Taylor Twellman, I don't hate you anymore. You're the man. In fact, I don't hate anyone from the Revolution anymore. You guys are all right. Even if you did ruin the playoffs for me 4 years in a row,